The nurse found me first, before she found any of them. "Are you Sarah Whitfield?" she asked, and I nodded, my heart already sinking because nobody calls you by your full name unless something has gone terribly wrong. "Your grandfather has been asking for you. He won't stop." I remember standing in that fluorescent-lit hallway of Mercy General, still in my scrubs from a 12-hour shift, and thinking, my grandfather is in Ohio. My grandfather is fine. My grandfather does not belong in a hospital in this city, 300 miles from his home, without a single member of his family beside him. But when I pushed open the door to room 214, there he was, Walter Higgins, 81 years old, a man who had built a modest hardware store into a chain of 6 across 2 counties, lying alone in a bed too big for his frail body, and 4 taped to the back of a hand that used to swing a hammer like it was nothing. His eyes found mine, and something in them cracked open. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice like dry paper. "They left me here." I asked him who left him, even though some sick, cold part of me already knew the answer. "Your uncle," he said. "Robert. And Diane. They said they were going to find parking." He let out a breath that sounded like it hurt. "That was 6 hours ago. I want you to understand something about my grandfather before I tell you what happened next, because what he did in the weeks that followed only makes sense if you know the kind of man he was." Walter Higgins did not cry. He had not cried at his own wife's funeral, not really, not where anyone could see. He was the kind of man who fixed things with his hands and solved problems with his mind and never, not once in 81 years, asked for help unless he absolutely had to. So when I saw tears standing in his eyes that night, unshed but visible, glassy and trembling, I felt something inside my chest turn to ice. This was not a man who had simply been forgotten in a busy parking garage. This was a man who understood, with sudden and total clarity, exactly what his family thought he was worth. Nothing. A burden to be set down and walked away from. I sat beside his bed and held his hand, and I asked him what had happened, really happened, because the story didn't add up. My grandfather had been in for what the doctors called a cardiac observation, chest pains that turned out, mercifully, to be nothing more than severe anxiety triggered by stress, though nobody yet knew what that stress was. Robert, my uncle, and his wife Diane had driven him the 3 hours from his home in Millbrook to this hospital because it had the best cardiac unit in the state, or so they'd told him. He'd been grateful. Touched, even, that his son had taken time off work to be with him. And then, somewhere between checking him into the emergency room and the hours that followed, they had simply vanished. No call. No text. His phone, they said later, needed charging, so he had no way to reach them even if he'd wanted to. The hospital staff had tried the emergency contact number on file, Robert's cell, 4 times. It went straight to voicemail every single time. I want to tell you that I called my uncle immediately and screamed at him, but that's not what I did. I am a nurse. I have spent 15 years learning that the loudest reaction is rarely the smartest one. Instead, I sat with my grandfather until nearly midnight, listening to him talk in fragments, piecing together a story that made less and less sense the more I heard it. He kept saying strange things. I should have listened to Ellen. Ellen was his late wife, my grandmother, dead 6 years now. I should have called Marion sooner. I had no idea who Marion was. And then, right before I finally convinced him to try to sleep, he gripped my wrist with a strength that startled me and said the words that would change everything. "Sarah. Tomorrow. First thing. I need you to take me to my lawyer." I told him he needed rest, that we could deal with lawyers later, that right now he needed to heal. He shook his head, and his eyes were suddenly sharp, clear, entirely unlike the eyes of a frightened old man. "No," he said. "Tomorrow. Before they realize I'm not where they left me." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the vinyl chair beside his bed, replaying every family gathering of the last 3 years, searching for the moment I had missed. Because there had been signs, I understood that now with the sick clarity of hindsight. 6 months ago, at Thanksgiving, Robert had made an offhand comment about Dad needing to simplify things, about the house in Millbrook being too much for one old man, about how it might make sense for Grandpa to sign some of the business assets over to make things easier down the road. I had thought it was nothing. Ordinary family planning, the kind every family has to have eventually. I had no idea, sitting in that dining room passing the mashed potatoes, that I was watching the opening move of something far darker. The next morning, against the advice of his doctor, my grandfather insisted on discharging himself. I signed the paperwork as his emergency contact, since apparently that honor had transferred to me sometime in the last 12 hours without anyone telling me, and I wheeled him out to my car while he gripped a manila folder to his chest that I hadn't even known he'd brought with him. "What's that?" I asked. "Everything," he said, and wouldn't say another word until we reached the office of Marian Castellano, attorney at law, in a modest brick building 40 minutes outside the city. Marian turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who greeted my grandfather like an old friend, which, as it turned out, she had been his lawyer for nearly 30 years, since before I was born, since before my Uncle Robert had even married Diane. She took one look at Walter's pale face and the folder in his hands and ushered us both into her office without a word of small talk. "Walter," she said, once the door was closed, "tell me what happened." And so he did, and I listened again, this time watching Marian's face grow tighter and tighter with every sentence. When he finished, she opened the folder he'd brought and spread its contents across her desk, and I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, because what I was looking at were bank statements. Dozens of them. Withdrawals from my grandfather's personal accounts going back nearly 2 years, amounts that started small, $300 here, $500 there, and grew steadily larger. $2,000. $5,000. A withdrawal of $41,000 made just 11 weeks ago. "I didn't authorize half of these," my grandfather said quietly. I thought I was just forgetting things. Diane set up online banking for me last year, said it would be easier for me to keep track. I stopped checking the statements because she said she was checking them for me. His hands were shaking now, and I reached over and covered them with mine. "I found the folder 2 weeks ago," he continued. "Real statements, the paper ones I still get sent to a post office box Ellen, and I kept private, one Diane doesn't know about. The numbers didn't match what Diane told me." Nothing matched. Marian asked him gently if he suspected Diane was acting alone, and my grandfather shook his head slowly, and the answer he gave broke something in me that I don't think has ever fully healed. "Robert signs half of them," he said. "My own son's signature is right there. Forging mine." I need you to sit with that for a moment, the way I had to sit with it in that lawyer's office, because it is one thing to suspect a daughter-in-law of manipulation and another thing entirely to see, in black ink on a bank ledger, your own child's handwriting forging yours. My Uncle Robert was not a stranger. He was not a con man who had married into the family for money. He was a boy I remembered teaching me to ride a bike in my grandparents' driveway, a man who had cried openly at his own mother's funeral, who had, as far as I knew, spent his whole life believing himself to be a decent person. And yet here was proof, undeniable and cold, that he had been stealing from his own father for the better part of 2 years, siphoning away the retirement my grandfather had spent 40 years building, one small, forgivable withdrawal at a time. The way you might slowly drain a pool so no one notices the water level dropping until the day the bottom shows. Marian asked the question that had been sitting unspoken in the room since we walked in. "Walter, why do you think they left you at the hospital?" My grandfather was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had a terrible steadiness to it, the voice of a man who has already worked out an answer he doesn't want to say out loud. "Because I told Robert 3 days ago that I found the real bank statements." I told him I knew. He looked up, and his eyes were wet again, but his jaw was set like stone. "I think they took me to that hospital hoping the stress would finish what the theft started. Or if it didn't, they'd have time to move the rest of the money and cover their tracks while everyone thought I was too sick and too confused to notice." I asked him, my voice barely above a whisper, if he really believed his own son wanted him dead, and he didn't answer right away. Instead, he said, "I don't know what Robert wants anymore." I don't think Robert knows either. But I know what Diane wants. Diane has wanted the Millbrook property since the week she married my son. Over the following days, a picture assembled itself that was uglier and more elaborate than I could have imagined watching Thanksgiving dinners come and go. Marion's investigator, a quiet, meticulous man named Deshawn who used to work fraud cases for the county, dug through 18 months of financial records and found that Diane had not only set up the online banking to intercept statements, she had also, 6 months earlier, filed paperwork attempting to have my grandfather declared unable to manage his own affairs, a legal move that would have handed financial power of attorney directly to Robert. The petition had been quietly withdrawn after the family doctor, an old friend of my grandfather's, refused to sign off on any diagnosis of incapacity. I remembered that doctor's visit. I remembered my grandfather telling me, almost as a joke, that Robert had insisted on a full checkup, just to be safe. I had thought it was sweet. I had told my grandfather he had a caring son. God, the things we don't see when we're looking right at them. There was more. There is always more in stories like this, and I want to walk you through it slowly because it mattered how the pieces came together, the way each one changed what the last one meant. Deshawn found records showing that 6 weeks before the hospital incident, Robert had contacted a real estate agent about the Millbrook property, my grandfather's house, the house where I had spent every summer of my childhood, the house where my grandmother had died in the upstairs bedroom with the yellow curtains, requesting an informal valuation. Not for sale. Just, the email said, to understand our options going forward. Our options. As though the house were already a shared asset, already halfway out of my grandfather's hands. And there was a name on those emails I didn't recognize at first, CC'd on nearly every message, Patricia Holloway, listed as family financial advisor. It took Deshawn one afternoon to discover that Patricia Holloway was Diane's older sister, operating without a license. Having been quietly stripped of her certification 11 years earlier following a client complaint that had never made it to court because the client had settled out of fear of a lengthy legal fight. Diane hadn't married into simple greed. She had married in, and then brought in reinforcements. I confronted my own feelings in the quiet hours of those weeks more than I confronted anyone else. There is a particular kind of grief in discovering that people you loved were capable of this, a grief that doesn't get spoken about enough, because it isn't about anyone dying. It's about the death of a version of your family that you'd believed in your whole life. I thought about my cousin, Robert, and Diane's son, Tyler, 22 years old and away at college, completely unaware, as far as I could tell, of any of it. I thought about what this would do to him. And I thought, more than once, about simply confronting Robert myself, screaming at him across some kitchen table until he cried and confessed and gave everything back. But Marion, when I told her this, shook her head firmly. "That's what they're counting on," she said. An emotional family blow-up that goes nowhere, that gets smoothed over with a tearful apology and a promise to do better, while nothing actually changes and the money stays gone. Walter didn't come to me for an apology. He came to me for justice. So we built it slowly, the way you build something meant to actually hold weight instead of something meant to just look good. My grandfather, once he was strong enough, sat for 3 separate recorded depositions detailing every withdrawal he could remember not authorizing, cross-referenced against Deshawn's paper trail. Marion filed for an emergency freeze on the joint accounts Diane had set up, cutting off access before another dollar could move. And quietly, without telling Robert or Diane a single word of what was happening, my grandfather revised his will and, more importantly, his living trust, moving the Millbrook property and the majority of the hardware store shares into an irrevocable trust that neither Robert nor Diane could touch, ever, regardless of what happened to him. I asked him, the day he signed it, whether it felt good. He looked at the papers on Marion's desk for a long moment and said, "It feels like locking the door after you already know someone's been inside your house. It doesn't feel like winning. It just feels like finally being safe." The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't the explosion I had once imagined. It happened 3 weeks after the hospital, in Marion's office, because Marion insisted that if Robert and Diane were going to be told anything, it needed to happen in a room with a lawyer present, on the record, with nothing left to interpretation or later denial. I sat beside my grandfather when they walked in, and I watched Robert's face when he saw his father sitting there upright, alert, very much alive and very much aware, not the fading, confused old man he had apparently been counting on. Diane's face did something colder and faster, a flicker of calculation before she settled into an expression of concern that didn't reach her eyes. "Dad," Robert started, "we've been calling the house. We didn't know where you—" My grandfather held up one hand, and something about the gesture, tired but absolute, stopped my uncle mid-sentence. "Don't," Walter said. "Please don't, Robert. Not here. Not with lies." What followed was 90 minutes I will never fully be able to describe, because so much of it happened in silences rather than words. Robert's silence when Marion laid the forged signatures on the table in front of him. A silence that stretched so long I genuinely didn't know if he would ever speak again. When he finally did, his voice cracked in a way that made some small, stubborn part of me want to feel sorry for him, and I hated that part of myself in that moment. "I was trying to protect the business," he said. "You wouldn't retire, Dad, you wouldn't let anyone help you, and I was scared that if something happened to you suddenly, we'd lose everything to taxes, to lawyers, I was trying to get ahead of it." Marion's voice, when she answered, was flat and precise as a scalpel. "You can call it protecting the business. The county attorney's office is going to call it elder financial exploitation, because that's what forging your father's signature to move his money is, regardless of your intentions." I watched the blood drain from Robert's face. Diane's composure finally cracked too, and what came out from underneath it was not remorse but fury. "This is insane," she snapped. "Walter, you're really going to do this to your own son? Over money? He's your family." My grandfather looked at her for a long moment, and then he said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "Family doesn't leave you in a hospital hoping you die quietly enough that nobody has to explain the withdrawals." The legal process that followed was neither fast nor especially dramatic, which I think surprised people who expected our lives to suddenly resemble a courtroom drama. There was no dramatic gavel, no perp walk. What there was, instead, was a long and thorough civil suit for financial recovery, combined with a criminal referral for elder fraud that the county prosecutor's office, once shown Deshawn's documentation, took seriously enough to pursue. Robert, facing the forged signatures with no real defense, accepted a plea agreement rather than risk a trial, restitution of every dollar traced, a felony conviction for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, 5 years of probation, and the loss of his position as a manager at one of my grandfather's own hardware stores, a position he had held for 11 years and would never hold again. Diane's involvement proved harder to prove in criminal court, since so much of what she'd done lived in the gray space of manipulation and coercion rather than clean forgery. But the civil suit stripped her and her sister Patricia of every dollar Deshawn could trace, and Marion made sure the story of Patricia's history, the lost license, the previous complaint, became part of the public record this time, closing a door that had been left dangerously open for over a decade. I won't pretend the family survived this the way families do in the stories that end neatly. Robert and my grandfather have not spoken since that day in Marion's office, though I know, because he told me once in a quiet, unguarded moment, that my grandfather still keeps a photograph of Robert as a boy on his nightstand. The version of his son from before all of this, the version he says he still grieves for even while he refuses to forgive the man that boy became. Tyler, my cousin, chose, and this took real courage on his part, at 22 years old, watching his own parents unravel in front of him, to stay close to his grandfather, driving up most weekends from school. And it is one of the few unbroken threads left in this family, one my grandfather holds onto with both hands. Diane moved out of state within the year, and the last I heard, she and Robert are separated, the marriage another casualty of what greed does to the people standing near it when it finally gets caught. As for my grandfather, he did not go back to Millbrook alone. He asked me, 6 months after that night at Mercy General, if I would consider moving into the guest house on the property, not out of any diminished capacity on his part, but because, as he put it with a small, tired smile, I'd like to spend the years I have left around people who'd never leave me somewhere to find parking. I said yes before he finished the sentence. These days, I watch him work in his garden most mornings before I leave for my shift, a stubborn old man who fixes things with his hands, who trusted the wrong people once and paid a devastating price for it, and who found, in the end, that the truth, however painful, was always going to be stronger than the silence his family had been counting on. He doesn't talk much about what happened anymore. But every so often, usually on quiet evenings on the porch, he'll look at me and say the same thing, and I don't think I'll ever get tired of hearing it. You were the one who came when I called, Sarah. That's the only inheritance that ever mattered. And I believe him, because I watched what happened to the family who thought money was worth more than showing up, and I watched what happened to the one person who simply, quietly, refused to leave.